Hello everybody, this is Philip Jonas at Kalamazoo Valley Community College, presenting OpenStax Principles of Economics, and today we're covering sections 19.3 through 19.5, GDP across time, countries, and compared to society's well-being. In this module, you will learn to explain recessions, depressions, peaks and troughs, evaluate the importance of tracking real GDP over time, compare GDP among countries, and evaluate how well GDP measures the well-being of society. In our last module, we learned about real GDP, looking at the production of our country, but removing the effects of inflation. Let's look at a longer time span of this number for the United States. Here we have real GDP since 1980. And of course, the first thing that sticks out is line goes up. Our economy has been growing, but not in a completely smooth path. From time to time, production falls. Now, if you look at the overall trend, these decreases are much less significant than line goes up over time. But at the time they happen, they can cause a tremendous amount of suffering, which is why we keep track of these fluctuations. You can already tell we have our recessions here highlighted as gray bars as always. And those gray bars sure seem to coincide with when real GDP dips. However, contrary to what some people think, the definition of a recession is not as simple as a change in real GDP. It's a little bit broader than that. We define a recession, or a little bit more technical, a contraction of the economy, as a significant, widespread, and sustained decline in economic activity, particularly in employment and personal income, not simply GDP, because that's where much of the suffering of a recession happens. People lose their jobs, their incomes, or maybe take some pay cuts. And if such a contraction is particularly severe, it might be referred to as a depression, like the 1929 Great Depression, but there's no formal economic definition of that. For us, it's just contraction when economic activity declines, and then, contrast to that, the normal state of our economy, expansion, when some economic growth factors, technology most of all, increases our ability to produce goods and services. So how do we measure contraction versus expansion? Well, it's directly tied to the concept of a peak or trough in economic activity. Those are the actual dates that are identified. When was economic activity at its highest? Before it started declining, that's the peak. When at its lowest? Before it started going back up. And the definition of a contraction then is the time period from peak to trough, and expansion, of course, from trough to peak. Interesting detail about these definitions in the context of the United States, while of course ultimately the federal statistical agencies report our contractions and expansions, they have been relying on a very prestigious non-profit think tank, so not a government agency, called the National Bureau of Economic Research, or NBER for short, to identify those dates. While that might change in the future, it's been working great for many decades for now, so I would expect this particular deal to continue. So let's have a closer look for the same time period that we were looking at on the Fred graph, what specifically the NBER has identified. So here, since the 1980s, we have every official peak and trough of the United States. And then right behind it, I'm following the exact same layout as on the NBER website here. We have the corresponding contractions and expansions. But you have to be a little bit careful when looking at those contractions and expansions. So those are the number of months that our economy was in each state, because they are defined using these peaks and troughs. So let's use 2001 as an example here. Peak in March, trough in November. So let's count that out real quick. We have January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. 8 months worth of contraction. That's where this number comes from, the 8. Each of those contraction figures in this particular layout refers to the peak and trough in that row. Most recently, February, March, April, 2 months of contraction. But the expansion number goes trough to peak. So which numbers are we comparing here? Well, there's a very convenient expansion here, 120 months. So that's 10 years on the dot. Where did we have 10 years worth of expansion? Well, let's check trough to peak. November 2001, December 2007, that's not 10 years on the dot. March 91, March 2001, that is 10 years on the dot. So in other words, in this layout, the expansion goes to the peak in the same row from the trough in the previous row. Just something to be a little bit careful about. You can also see that expansions, very nice for us, tend to last much longer than contractions, which tend to be a bad deal when they happen. And of course, we'll even discuss some policy tools to try to get those under control. So this is how we evaluate our GDP over time. Are we expanding or contracting? But another important dimension of comparing GDP is to look at different countries. And that presents an additional problem. Since GDP is measured using the currency of the country we're measuring, how do we compare GDP from different countries? Now, at first, you might say, okay, this is quite obvious. You can exchange currencies between countries. There's an exchange rate, right? So let's just convert it to a common currency, and there's our comparison. And by all means, that is a reasonable approach, but it's not always the best. If you have experience buying things in other countries, you might have noticed after converting currencies, prices between products can actually be quite different in different countries. You know, get a haircut in China, after converting currencies, it'll probably still be much cheaper than a haircut in the United States. So in this case, are we really comparing apples to apples or haircuts to haircuts? Well, there is a second approach. A very impressive worldwide statistical initiative run by the World Bank. It's called the International Comparison Program, or ICP for short. And it collects GDP and price data from participating countries, and there are a lot of participating countries, to produce so-called purchasing power parities, or PPPs for short. Now, purchasing power parity is also a type of exchange rate, but it's not the actual exchange rate at which you can exchange currencies in a market. That's determined by supply and demand. But rather, it answers the question, at what conversion rate is the purchasing power the same? So if we want to compare how much currencies can buy in different countries, what's the right number for that? Again, the purchasing power parity between the countries as opposed to the market exchange rate. So let me go ahead and show you a huge table that just lists some of the countries participating in the International Comparison Program. And these are the 2017 results. So what the World Bank here does is it converts the GDP of different countries. Here we've got lots of countries and their GDP measured using Bs, so the billions of course, of LCUs. Those would be local currency units. So for example, here's US GDP 2017, 19.5 trillion US dollars. Same year, Australian GDP, 1.8 trillion Australian dollars. And we've got the Brazilian reals, the Chinese yuan renminbi, and so on and so forth. So now, the World Bank gives us numbers where number one, it converts the GDP to a common currency using the market exchange rate, often abbreviated XR. Which common currency? Very convenient for us. US dollars. Isn't that nice, right? So like by definition, exchange rate of US dollar to US dollar, 1. You'll notice the US number the same here and here. And then it converts it a second time to a common currency, not using the market exchange rate, but the purchasing power parity instead. Once again, very convenient for us. That would still be the US dollar. So once again, for the US, all the GDP numbers, the same figure. All the exchange rate, whether market or purchasing power parity, by definition, the number 1. That's our reference number. But now, let's look at some other countries, right? So for example, comparison with the Brazilian real. If we look at the market exchange rate to buy a US dollar in 2017, you would have to bring a little over 3 Brazilian reals. But to buy as much in Brazil using your reals as you could buy in the US using US dollars, you would only need a little over 2 Brazilian reals. So on a purchasing power parity basis, that means the reals have more spending power than the market exchange rate would suggest. And as always, of course, that means we can also do some math. So let's start out by looking at the possibilities here and go through every possible scenario. What if you are being asked to calculate the GDP of another country based on a purchasing power parity? So here we've got 82 trillion yuan renminbi worth of Chinese GDP, and we are asking the question, well, what's that in purchasing power parity dollars? So first of all, we already have the result, what that is in terms of market exchange rates. Market exchange rate, 6.8 yuan renminbi per US dollar. So we divide the Chinese GDP by the exchange rate, we get Chinese GDP, $12 trillion at market exchange rates. A significantly lower number than the GDP of the United States in 2017. But what if we take price differences into account? So now we're going to find Chinese purchasing power parity GDP by taking Chinese GDP in local currency units and dividing it by the purchasing power parity. Let's plug in what we know. We've got 82 trillion here, and we're going to divide that by a purchasing power parity of about 4.2. And what do we find? Well, on a purchasing power parity basis, in 2017 already, Chinese GDP, total economic output, was actually a little bit higher, but very comparable to United States GDP. Which perspective is more relevant? Market exchange rate or purchasing power parity? As always, that depends on the question you're asking. If you're talking about ability to buy global goods and services, like let's say, for example, we are telling a story about oil, okay, market exchange rate is going to be more relevant. But if we're talking about what is the cost of living situation of a Chinese citizen buying some products, well, this purchasing power parity number is going to be much more relevant. So what other possibilities can we encounter? Well, let me start out by showing you a nice comparison between France and Germany. Now, interesting case here, France and Germany, of course, share a currency. They both use euros. So let's say we're going the other way around. You are being asked to find French GDP in euros, and you know French GDP in US dollars, market rate or purchasing power parity. Well, that of course means you can get there in two different ways. You can take your market rate GDP, multiply by the market exchange rate and get a number, or you can get your purchasing power parity GDP, multiply by the PPP exchange rate and presumably get the same number. Just make sure to be consistent, right? The market exchange rate goes with market rate GDP, PPP goes with GDP in PPP terms. So let's do both calculations at once, plug in our variables. One approach is we're taking our $2.6 trillion here, multiplying by 0.89, or we're taking our $3 trillion here, multiplying by 0.77. Should come out to be the same number. Punch it into your calculator. Not quite the same number. What's going on here? Well, a little something called significant digits that you might remember from your science classes. We are comparing different levels of precision here. Our market exchange rate and PPP only have 3 significant digits. So our result, if we are expressing it with higher precision, there's 5 digits here, might actually not be a perfect match. If we want to do proper significant digit math, we want to round that back down to 3 significant digits. Done so here. And then, bam, notice it, perfect match. Now, don't worry, this is not going to be a course about significant digits. So should you encounter such a problem on a test, I will tell you precisely how many digits I would like you to round to. So now we've done a conversion from local currency GDP to US dollar GDP, PPP and market exchange rate. And we've gone the other way, US dollar GDP back to local currency. What's left? Well, of course, you might also be asked to solve for an exchange rate. And for our convenience, you might have noticed already, we are defining our exchange rates here as how many local currency units do you get per US dollar. So for example, in the year 2017 here, looking at the market exchange rate of France, 1 US dollar was worth 88.5 euro cents. But what about Germany? Okay, same conversion. We are looking for the market exchange rate in that year, solving for E. And because we're defining it as local currency units per US dollar, we have to take a local currency unit GDP and divide it by US dollar GDP. And since we're solving for the market version, make sure market, matchy, matchy. Okay, so let's plug in some numbers. In 2017, we are trying to solve for variable E, where GDP in local currency units for Germany was about 3.2 trillion euros. Divide that by 3.7 trillion GDP in US dollars. What do we find? The result is about 0.885 after rounding. Surprise! It's of course the exact same number as we see for France because they share a common currency. So in the market, a euro will be worth the same in France or Germany. But this once again highlights what purchasing power parity does for us. So even though these two countries share a currency, doesn't mean prices are necessarily identical in these two countries. Notice the purchasing power parity is slightly different between these countries. You would need 74 euro cents to buy in Germany in that year what a dollar buys in the US. You would need 77 euro cents to buy the same amount in France. All right, so this is all possible conversions you might encounter on a test. What else can we do? Well, so far we've discussed the GDP of these countries on a total economy basis. And you might have noticed these numbers can be big, small, country sizes vary, right? Let me put up a chart. So here is a graphic from the World Bank comparing GDP of countries around the world on a purchasing power parity basis. So for example, in 2017, we've already established on a purchasing power parity basis, Chinese and US GDP, basically the same number. So those two areas, very close in size. Let's look at some other things that I want to come back to numerically in just a second. Here's the Europe and Central Asia region. We see Germany, big box, right? Norway, smaller box. Then really tiny here, you can barely read it, Luxembourg. We'll look at those numbers. So first, let's do our comparison between the United States and China a second time on a slightly different basis. We already discussed on a purchasing power parity basis, very similar numbers. But does that mean these countries are comparably rich, if you will, on a per person basis? You can probably already anticipate where this is going. These countries might produce a similar amount of goods and services in total, but the populations are vastly different. So in 2017, we've got the United States with about 325 million people, and China with 1.4 billion people. So same production in total, very different production per person. Let's look into that comparison. One possible comparison, you might be asked to work out GDP per capita. So that means GDP per person. We've already got the number for China here on a purchasing power parity basis. Chinese GDP, about $14,000 in 2017. Let's do the same conversion for the US. Very simple on a superficial basis. We're doing per person here. So we're going to take that GDP number. We're going to divide it by population. But the thing you have to look out for is often when you find these numbers in a table or something like that, the units might be different. So let's have a real close look here. Our GDP figure, billions. Our population figure, millions. So we got to do a unit conversion while we're at it, right? So we're not simply taking this number divided by that number. We're taking this number and we're multiplying it by 1,000 to convert it into millions so that we then can divide by population already in millions and get an actual per person number. And what do we end up with? GDP per capita in 2017 for the United States, $60,000. Much higher than Chinese GDP per capita. We would often refer to, as a consequence, the United States as a rich country, China as a middle income country, because while the total production is very similar, of course, on a per person basis, is going to be the stronger connection to a country's standard of living. Okay, let's look at how we can go the other way around as well. Even though we've already seen this number, let's get at it from a different perspective. If we, in the same table, wanted to work out Chinese GDP, again, we're going from per person to total. On a basic level, simple enough, take per person, multiply by the number of persons, there's your total. But watch those unit conversions, right? The population is in millions. Our result is supposed to be in billions. So once we take our result from GDP per capita times population, we're going to have to divide that by 1,000 to go from millions to billions, or once again, it's about the same number as total US GDP. Finally, let's see how we can solve for population, and that'll give us another fun little comparison here. So I already highlighted our trio of European countries here. We look at total GDP amounts. Germany, much bigger than Norway, much bigger than Luxembourg. Does that mean that there are like much lower standards of living in Norway than in Germany, and in Luxembourg than in Norway and Germany? Of course not. Populations are vastly different. Luxembourg has a population of not even 1 million. Norway is at 5. And well, let's find out where Germany comes in, right? Here's the numbers we've got. We know that the GDP is $4.4 trillion. We know the GDP per person is 53,000. How do we convert that? Well, if we want to solve for the number of persons, we're going to have to rearrange our equation a little bit. GDP per capita is GDP divided by population. Let us rearrange. If we want to solve for population, we end up taking GDP divided by GDP per capita. And once again, pay attention to the units. Because if we take this GDP number, which is in billions, and divide it by GDP per capita, our result for population would be in billions, but we're looking for a result in millions. So we're going to have to go ahead and multiply by 1,000 to go from billions to millions. Punch into your calculator, what do we find? Why is Germany's economy so much bigger in total? Because it has a way higher population, 83 million to Luxembourg 600,000. So even though GDP per capita is much higher in Luxembourg, total GDP much bigger number for Germany. Here is a map of all the GDP per capita numbers on a purchasing power parity basis from 2019. We can see a couple of gray zones here. Not everybody participates, but you can see coverage is actually widespread. And once again, this is coming from the International Comparison Project, which of course means, hey, anytime you draw a map, somebody might be unhappy with how you draw that map. So big disclaimer here at the bottom. Anything that's going on here is not an endorsement from the World Bank about the legal status of any territory, border, or anything along those lines. But nevertheless, it lets us see the one aspect of the development status of these various countries. I mean, it's not just about GDP per capita, right? If you want to compare the development of countries, normally you also want to look at some measures such as education, such as healthcare, but GDP is the one we are learning about in this module. And roughly speaking, there are no super formal cutoffs here. Anything that's in a dark blue, here, we'd often colloquially refer to that as a rich country or a high-income country. And then if we are looking at the paler blue and greens, so like here, more commonly those would be referred to as middle-income countries. And finally, in the dark greens, we are going to be looking at so-called low-income countries. So that's how you can use GDP to do one type of comparison between countries. But I've already alluded to it, GDP is not the end-all, be-all of a standard of living. When we talk about standard of living, we really are talking about all elements that affect people's well-being. But not all of those elements are bought and sold in markets, which is ultimately what we base our GDP measures on. So always keep in mind, while gross domestic product is our flagship economic activity measure, it is not complete. Let me just mention a couple of things that don't show up in GDP. Homemaking, any work you do for yourself. So, for example, if we have a country where we have more stay-at-home parents, relatively speaking, doing lots of valuable work, maybe food prep, maybe home maintenance, maybe laundry, child rearing, it's not going to show up in GDP because it's not market traded. We've got another country, the kids are going to daycare, we're hiring some contractors to fix the home, we're eating at the restaurant more often. GDP is going to be a bigger number just because of that difference, not necessarily because of the standard of living being different. And it goes on and on. The underground economy, everything that's happening under the table, so to speak, right? Big differences, how much of that happens between countries. And that's not counted in GDP. Leisure time. You know, not working has value too. And the average person in one country might get a very different amount of vacation from the average person in another country, if you know what I'm talking about. By itself, the lower GDP. Does that mean the person with more time off is worse off? I wouldn't go there. What about nature itself? This can be anything from, so how nice is the climate in your country? Down to, well, if we have a nasty environmental disaster like an oil spill, GDP is not going to be decreased because of that oil spill, just because of how we count. In fact, weirdly, because GDP covers market activity and that oil spill might prompt some environmental cleanup, it might increase GDP because of that activity. But that activity didn't make the people better off, it's trying to remedy some damage. GDP by itself doesn't directly include how healthy people are, how long they live. GDP measures how much there is total. Maybe we divide it by population, but that tells us nothing about the distribution of that income. And finally, education. Call me a little biased. I like to think it has value in itself in making people better off beyond raising GDP or incomes. Again, not a comprehensive list, but just these 7 are already huge and not part of GDP. So always be mindful of that in your comparisons. That concludes our discussion of sections 19.3 through 19.5. In this module, you learned how to explain recessions, depressions, peaks, and troughs. Evaluate the importance of tracking real GDP over time. Compare GDP among countries, and evaluate how well GDP measures the well-being of society. I will see you next time.